I can still remember the exact moment I decided to leave everything behind for Nancy. It was a cold, rainy afternoon in November, and we were sitting in a small cafe near her parents' house. She was nervous, twisting her hands in her lap, her eyes darting from me to the rain-soaked window and back again. I had just proposed the idea of us moving out of the city center into a more affordable, modest area, a place where she could be closer to her family and her childhood friends. "Are you sure, Henry?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know how much you love your life here. Your work, your friends." I didn't hesitate. "I'm sure," I said. "None of that matters to me as much as you do." It was true. When I met Nancy, something inside me shifted. I had grown up in a wealthy family, my father a successful real estate developer, my mother a philanthropist with deep connections to the city's social elite. My life had been one of privilege and opportunity, but it always felt empty. I'd had friends who grew up like me, surrounded by luxury, never worrying about money or status. But none of them made me feel the way Nancy did. She was different, down to earth, selfless, with a warmth that made everything else seem insignificant. She came from a working-class family, her parents living in a humble neighborhood where everyone knew each other. It was a world far from the one I had known, but for her, I was willing to give up anything. And I did. Within a few months, I sold my upscale apartment in the city, resigned from the lucrative position my father had arranged for me at his company, and cut ties with many of my high-society friends. It wasn't a clean break. Some of them were baffled by my decision, while others outright told me I was making a huge mistake. They couldn't understand why I would give up everything I had worked for, everything that had been handed to me, for a woman who didn't fit into our world. But I didn't care. Nancy was my world. We moved to the other side of town, where the streets were narrower, the houses smaller, and life was simpler. It wasn't an easy transition. The area Nancy wanted to live in was far from where I grew up, a working-class neighborhood where her parents and most of her friends still lived. The houses were older, some run down, with peeling paint and small yards filled with toys, laundry lines, and the occasional rusted car. It wasn't what I was used to, but I convinced myself it didn't matter. After all, this was for her. This was our future. I found a modest job managing a local hardware store, a far cry from the corporate world I had known. The pay was decent, but nowhere near what I had been making before. Yet, seeing Nancy happy, surrounded by her family and childhood friends, made it all worth it. She had this light in her eyes whenever she was with them, a happiness that made me believe I had made the right choice. For a while, everything was perfect. We got married in a small ceremony at a local church, nothing like the grand affairs my family had envisioned for me. But it was intimate, personal, and exactly what Nancy wanted. After the wedding, things settled into a comfortable rhythm. We spent weekends with her parents, had dinners with her friends, and began building our life together in this little corner of the world I had never thought I'd call home. Then, a year later, our son, Thomas, was born. If I thought I knew love before, I hadn't been prepared for the overwhelming joy I felt when I held my baby boy for the first time. He had Nancy's eyes and my nose, and from the moment I laid eyes on him, I knew I'd do anything to protect him, to give him the best life possible, even if that meant continuing to live in a way I had never imagined for myself. Nancy seemed even happier after Thomas was born. She was a natural mother, patient, loving, and always putting his needs above her own. We had our struggles, as all new parents do, but we faced them together. We were a team, or so I thought. It started slowly, in ways I barely noticed at first. One of Nancy's closest friends, a guy named Greg, began coming around more often. Greg was an old friend from her high school days, someone who had always been a part of her life. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was friendly, good with Thomas, and helped out around the house when I was at work. Nancy always talked about how close they had been growing up, so it didn't strike me as odd that he would be such a frequent presence in our lives. At first, I appreciated the help. Managing the hardware store didn't leave me much time to be at home, and with Nancy adjusting to being a new mom, Greg's extra pair of hands seemed like a blessing. He would babysit Thomas from time to time, giving Nancy a chance to rest or run errands. He was around so often that it almost felt like he was part of the family. But over time, I started to notice little things that made me uneasy. The way Greg would linger a bit too long after dinner, even when it was clear I was ready for him to leave. The way Nancy's face lit up when he walked through the door, a kind of excitement that I hadn't seen in a while. And then there were the moments I would come home from work and find Greg alone with Thomas while Nancy was out, running errands she hadn't mentioned to me beforehand. I tried to push the doubts from my mind. Greg was her friend. He had always been in her life, and there was no reason to suspect anything. Nancy loved me. We had a child together, a life we had built from the ground up. There was no way she would jeopardize that. But then, the subtle signs became harder to ignore. As the months went on, I began to feel a distance growing between Nancy and me. It was hard to put into words, but it was there. A quiet, invisible wall that seemed to rise between us. We still talked, still shared our days, but the closeness we once had felt strained. I told myself it was just the stress of parenthood, the exhaustion of sleepless nights and demanding days. But deep down, I knew something else was wrong. Nancy became more secretive. She started going out more often, leaving Thomas with Greg or her mother while she ran errands or met up with friends. When I asked her about it, she would brush it off, saying she just needed some time to herself. I tried to be understanding. I knew how hard being a new mom could be, and I didn't want to make her feel guilty for needing a break. But the unease grew. One evening, I came home from work to find Greg already at the house. Nancy wasn't home. She had gone out to pick up some groceries, according to Greg. He was sitting on the couch, holding Thomas, who was fast asleep in his arms. I forced a smile, trying to push down the strange feeling in my gut. "Thanks for watching him," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "No problem," Greg replied, smiling down at Thomas. "You know I love spending time with the little guy." I nodded, but something about the way he said it bothered me. It was too familiar, too comfortable. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was overreacting. Greg had always been there for Nancy. He was just helping out, nothing more. But later that night, as I lay in bed next to Nancy, I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had hugged Greg when she came home, the way they had exchanged a look that made my stomach twist. The doubts began to consume me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening right under my nose, something I couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of my being. I became more vigilant, more watchful. Every time Greg came over, I studied the way he and Nancy interacted, searching for any sign that my suspicions were more than just paranoia. It wasn't until one afternoon, when I came home early from work, that everything began to unravel. I had left the store early because I wasn't feeling well. The stress of work, combined with the gnawing doubts about my marriage, had taken its toll on me. I just wanted to come home, see Nancy and Thomas, and forget about everything for a while. But when I pulled into the driveway, Greg's car was parked outside. I didn't think much of it at first. He was often over when I wasn't around, helping Nancy with Thomas. But something about that day felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that made my heart race as I approached the front door. When I stepped inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Thomas wasn't crying or babbling the way he usually did. The TV wasn't on, and there was no sound of Nancy moving around in the kitchen. I called out for her, my voice echoing through the house. No answer. I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, the unease growing with every step. As I reached the door, I heard voices, low, murmured, coming from inside. My hand froze on the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. Without thinking, I pushed the door open. What I saw on the other side shattered everything I had believed about my life. Nancy and Greg were sitting on the edge of the bed, their bodies close, their hands intertwined. They weren't kissing, but the intimacy of their position, the way they were looking at each other, it was unmistakable. They both jumped when they saw me, their faces pale, eyes wide with shock and guilt. "Henry," Nancy whispered, her voice trembling. "I can explain." But there was nothing to explain. I had seen enough. I stood there, frozen, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was seeing. My wife, the woman I had given up everything for, was sitting on our bed, holding hands with another man, and not just any man. Greg, the man who had been a constant presence in our lives, who had held our son, eaten meals with us, laughed with us. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The betrayal was so deep, so overwhelming, that it felt like I was suffocating. My chest tightened, my throat constricting as I fought to keep myself together. What the hell is this? I finally managed to choke out, my voice raw with anger. Nancy stood up, her face flushed with panic. Henry, it's not what it looks like. I laughed bitterly, my hands shaking. Not what it looks like. Are you kidding me? I walk in on you sitting here with him, and you expect me to believe that nothing's going on? Greg stood up too, his hands raised as if to calm me down. Henry, listen, man. It's not like that. Nancy and we were just talking. Talking? I spat, my rage boiling over. You've been in my house every day, around my family, and now I find you here, alone with my wife, holding her hand? You expect me to believe this is innocent? Nancy's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped closer to me, reaching out as if to touch my arm. I flinched away from her, disgusted by the thought of her touch. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I stared at her, the woman I had given up everything for, the woman I had loved more than anything in this world. How long? I demanded, my voice low, dangerous. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, her eyes flicking to Greg, who looked equally uncomfortable. Finally, she whispered, a few months. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. A few months? How had I not seen it? How had I been so blind? And what about Thomas? I asked, my voice trembling with rage. You let him watch our son while this affair was happening behind my back? Nancy's tears flowed freely now, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. All I could see was the betrayal, the lies, the destruction of everything I had given up for her. I need you to leave, I said, my voice cold and final. Henry, please, she begged. We can talk about this. We can. No, I said firmly, cutting her off. I don't want to hear another word from either of you. Just get out. Greg opened his mouth to say something, but I shot him a look that made him think better of it. He grabbed his jacket and hurried out the door, leaving Nancy and me standing in the middle of the room, the silence between us deafening. The days that followed were a blur of anger, pain, and confusion. Nancy moved out temporarily, staying with her parents while we tried to figure out what to do next. I kept Thomas with me, clinging to him as the only thing left in my life that hadn't been tainted by lies. I was broken. Everything I had sacrificed, my career, my family, my friends, I had done it for Nancy. I had believed in her, in us, and now it was all gone. My family had been right. My friends had been right. They had warned me about giving up everything for her, about throwing away the life I had built for myself. But I hadn't listened. I had convinced myself that love was enough, that we could build a life together no matter where we were, no matter what we left behind. But love hadn't been enough. The betrayal haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nancy and Greg together. Every time I walked through the house, I felt the weight of what had happened in every room. The place that had once been our home now felt like a prison, a constant reminder of everything I had lost. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out. I filed for divorce a month later. It wasn't a dramatic decision, just one that felt necessary. Nancy had begged me to reconsider, to go to counseling, to try and rebuild what we had lost. But I couldn't. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. I couldn't forgive what she had done. I moved out of the house, taking Thomas with me. We found a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the neighborhood I had sacrificed everything to be in. I cut ties with most of the people I had met there, unable to bear the thought of seeing them again, of hearing their whispers and knowing they knew about the affair. Nancy saw Thomas regularly, and we kept things civil for his sake. But our conversations were brief, and we avoided talking about anything that wasn't strictly related to him. The love that had once defined our relationship was gone, replaced by a cold, distant politeness. In the months that followed, I struggled to rebuild my life. I went back to school, hoping to retrain in something that would offer more financial stability. I reconnected with old friends, people I had pushed away when I left my old life behind for Nancy. Some of them welcomed me back, while others kept their distance, still wary of the choices I had made. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of failure that hung over me. I had lost everything for love, and in the end, love had betrayed me. It took time, years, in fact, but eventually, I started to heal. Thomas grew older, and being a father gave me purpose, something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. I found a new job, one that wasn't glamorous or prestigious, but allowed me to provide for my son. Nancy remarried a couple of years after the divorce. I didn't know the details, and I didn't want to. I had moved on, or at least, I was trying to. The pain of what happened between us never fully disappeared. It lingered like a scar, a reminder of the cost of love, the risks we take when we give everything to someone else. But I had learned to live with it, to accept that some things in life don't have happy endings. And that was okay. I had Thomas. I had a new sense of purpose, a new understanding of what it meant to rebuild a life after losing everything. And I knew one thing for sure. I would never again sacrifice my own happiness for someone else's. In the end, I learned that love can be both beautiful and destructive. It can lift you up or tear you apart. But no matter what, you have to find a way to move forward, to rebuild, even when the pieces seem too broken to put back together. For me, the price of love had been steep, but I survived. And that, in the end, was enough. Life settled into a kind of rhythm after the divorce. I focused on Thomas, my work, and trying to create a new sense of normalcy. Nancy had moved on with her new husband, Greg, of all people, and while it still stung, I forced myself to stop caring. I told myself I was over it. I told myself I was fine. Then, one day, something strange happened. A letter arrived at my apartment. It was postmarked from our old neighborhood, where Nancy and I used to live. I hadn't spoken to anyone from that part of town in years, and I couldn't imagine who would be reaching out to me now. I opened the letter cautiously, my heart pounding as I read the short, cryptic message inside. There are things you don't know. We need to talk. Meet me at the park, tomorrow at noon. There was no signature, just those few sentences written in messy, hurried handwriting. My gut instinct told me to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. What could this possibly be about? Had Nancy gotten herself into more trouble? Was this about Greg? Against my better judgment, I decided to go. The next day, I arrived at the park a little before noon, sitting on a bench near the playground where I used to bring Thomas. Memories of our happier days as a family tugged at me, but I pushed them aside, trying to focus on the present. The air was heavy with anticipation, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. A few minutes later, I saw a figure approaching. It was a woman middle-aged, with short dark hair and an anxious expression. I didn't recognize her at first, but as she got closer, something clicked. It was Jenny, one of Nancy's old friends. We hadn't spoken in years, but she had been around a lot during our early days in the neighborhood. She was one of the friends I had distanced myself from after the divorce. "Henry," she said, sitting down next to me, her voice low and urgent. "I'm glad you came. What's this about?" I asked, my voice cautious. "Why reach out now? After all this time?" Jenny hesitated, looking around as if she was afraid someone might overhear us. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes filled with concern. "I know you probably don't want to hear this," she began, "but I thought you deserved to know. There's something about Nancy, about her relationship with Greg, that you don't know." My stomach tightened. I had tried to leave the past behind, to stop thinking about Nancy and Greg and what had happened between us. But the way Jenny was looking at me, the urgency in her voice, told me this was something I couldn't ignore. "What are you talking about?" I asked, feeling a growing sense of dread. Jenny took a deep breath. "The affair between Nancy and Greg. It didn't start a few months before you found out, Henry. It started years ago, almost as soon as you two moved into the neighborhood." I blinked, stunned. "What? That's not possible." "She would have. I would have noticed." Jenny shook her head. "No, you wouldn't have. Nancy was good at hiding it, and Greg, well, he played his part perfectly. He knew how to be around you, how to act like nothing was going on. But trust me, Henry, it started long before you had any idea." My mind reeled. Years? They had been together for years behind my back? How could I have been so blind? And that's not all, Jenny continued, her voice trembling. Greg, he wasn't just seeing Nancy for fun. There's something else. Something worse. What do you mean? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Jenny swallowed hard, as if she was struggling to get the words out. Greg was never interested in a real relationship with Nancy. He's involved in something. Something illegal. And Nancy's caught up in it now. Jenny's words hit me like a freight train. I had already processed the pain of the affair, the betrayal of Nancy and Greg's relationship. But now, hearing that Greg had ulterior motives, that there was something darker at play, made the betrayal feel fresh again. What is Greg involved in? I demanded, my voice low but intense. What's he done? Jenny hesitated, clearly reluctant to tell me. I don't know everything, but I've heard rumors. Greg has been involved in shady business dealings for years, fraud, money laundering, even connections to organized crime. He hides it well, but there's a reason he was always so comfortable hanging around Nancy and your son. He's been using them, Henry. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Using them? How? I think he's been using Nancy's name, her accounts, to funnel money. She doesn't know, at least not fully. But she's in too deep now. She can't get out. My head spun. If what Jenny was saying was true, Greg wasn't just a man who had an affair with my wife. He was a criminal, and Nancy was entangled in his schemes. She's in danger, Henry, Jenny said, her voice shaking. And so is Thomas. The mention of my son snapped me out of my daze. Thomas? I repeated, feeling a surge of protectiveness. What does this have to do with Thomas? Jenny looked away, as if she didn't want to tell me. Greg, he's been talking about taking Thomas with him. If things go south, he might try to disappear with your son. My blood ran cold. All the anger, all the hurt I had buried for so long came flooding back in a tidal wave of fear and fury. Where is he now? I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. I drove to Nancy's house in a blind panic. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, my mind racing with the worst possible scenarios. Thomas, my son. Greg was using him, using Nancy, and I hadn't seen it. I had been so focused on my own pain, my own betrayal, that I had missed the danger right in front of me. When I pulled up to the house, I saw Greg's car parked in the driveway. A surge of adrenaline shot through me, and I jumped out of the car, not caring if I was making a scene. I pounded on the door, my fists hitting the wood so hard it rattled the frame. Nancy, open the door. After a tense moment, Nancy opened the door, her face pale and confused. Henry, what are you? Where's Greg? I demanded, pushing past her into the house. Nancy grabbed my arm, trying to stop me. What are you doing? You can't just. Where is he, Nancy? I shouted, turning to face her, my chest heaving with anger. Tell me where he is. I know everything. Her eyes widened in fear, and for a moment, I thought she might lie to me. But then she glanced toward the living room, where Greg was standing, his face calm and infuriatingly composed. What's going on here? Greg asked, his voice casual, as if he wasn't hiding a thing. You've been using her, I said, my voice low with rage. You've been using Nancy and my son to cover your tracks. I know about your schemes, Greg. I know about the money. Greg's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something. Fear? Annoyance? In his eyes. You don't know what you're talking about, he said smoothly, stepping closer to Nancy. I've done nothing wrong. You're letting your jealousy cloud your judgment. Jealousy? I spat, my hands clenching into fists. This isn't about jealousy anymore. It's about my son. I know what you've been planning. Nancy looked between us, her face pale with confusion. What's happening, Greg? What is he talking about? Greg placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle. Nancy, he's just trying to stir up trouble. He's always been bitter about the divorce. But Nancy wasn't convinced. Her eyes searched Greg's face, and for the first time, I saw doubt flicker in her expression. She stepped away from him, looking at me with desperation. Henry, is it true? I nodded, my voice shaking with emotion. He's been using you, Nancy. He's been laundering money through your accounts, setting you up. And now, He's planning to take Thomas. Nancy gasped, covering her mouth with her hands as she backed away from Greg. No, she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Greg, is this true? Greg's face hardened, and in that moment, I saw the mask drop. His calm demeanor vanished, replaced by cold, ruthless calculation. You should have kept your mouth shut, Henry, Greg said, his voice now a low growl. Greg lunged for Nancy, grabbing her arm and pulling her close. She yelped in surprise, her eyes wide with fear. Let her go, I shouted, stepping forward. But Greg pulled something out from his jacket, a gun. My heart stopped. He pointed it at me, his eyes cold and dangerous. You don't understand how deep this goes, Greg hissed. I'm not going to let you ruin everything I've worked for. You're not taking Thomas from me. He's not your son. I spat, my voice shaking. You're not taking him anywhere. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The three of us were locked in a deadly standoff, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. And then, in a flash of desperation, Nancy acted. She grabbed Greg's arm, twisting it as hard as she could. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the small room, but the shot missed. I rushed forward, tackling Greg to the ground, wrestling the gun out of his hand. We struggled for what felt like an eternity, my body fueled by rage and fear. Finally, I managed to get the gun away from him, and I pointed it at his chest, my hand shaking. It's over, Greg, I said, my voice hoarse. You're done. Greg glared up at me, his chest heaving, but he didn't move. Nancy was sobbing in the corner, her hands covering her face. I looked at her, my heart breaking for the woman I had once loved, the mother of my child. It's over, I repeated, my voice softer now. Greg was arrested that night. It turned out Jenny was right. He had been involved in criminal activity for years, using Nancy as his cover. The authorities uncovered everything, and Greg was sentenced to prison for a long list of charges, including fraud and conspiracy. Nancy and I were left to pick up the pieces. Our relationship was shattered beyond repair, but we worked together to make sure Thomas was safe, and that he would never have to suffer because of the choices we made. I never fully recovered from the betrayal, not just from Nancy's affair, but from the realization that I had been blind for so long. Blind to the dangers lurking in my own home, blind to the man who had nearly destroyed everything I loved. But in the end, I saved my son. And that, I realized, was the only thing that mattered. As I watched Thomas grow up, I found solace in the fact that no matter what had happened between Nancy and me, no matter how much pain and heartbreak we had endured, I had protected him from the darkness that had almost consumed us. And that was enough. The weeks following Greg's arrest were a blur of legal battles, sleepless nights, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Yet, somehow, I had to keep going for Thomas. I didn't hear much from Nancy after the dust settled. She moved back in with her parents temporarily while everything unfolded, and our conversations were brief, strained. We communicated through lawyers mostly, making arrangements for custody of Thomas and handling the fallout from Greg's criminal enterprise. The police dug deep into Greg's dealings, and with Nancy's full cooperation, they uncovered the full extent of his schemes. The money laundering, fraud, and even ties to organized crime. It was all there. Nancy's accounts had been used in ways she never realized, her name tied to transactions that could have landed her in prison if not for her cooperation with the authorities. She had come perilously close to being pulled under by Greg's deceit. But that wasn't the worst part. One night, after Thomas was asleep and I was trying to catch up on paperwork for my new job, the phone rang. It was Nancy. It had been a while since we'd spoken directly. Everything had felt too raw. I hesitated before answering, unsure of what she wanted to say. Henry, she began, her voice shaky. There's something else, something I didn't tell you before. I clenched my jaw, bracing for more bad news. What is it, Nancy? I didn't know how to say this, she continued, her voice almost trembling. But I think Greg was planning something worse. He mentioned taking Thomas and disappearing. But there's more. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. More? What do you mean? She hesitated, and then finally, The words came out. I think Greg was going to hurt me. I found something he was hiding in the house. What did you find, Nancy? There was a long pause, and then she said, I found a fake passport with my name on it. But it wasn't my photo. Nancy's revelation sent a chill through me. A fake passport? Her name but not her photo? What had Greg been planning? I could hear the fear in her voice as she explained. I found it hidden in the back of one of his old suitcases. There were documents, things I don't understand. I think he was planning to set me up, Henry. He was going to take Thomas, make it look like I had run off with him. I stood up, pacing the room as the gravity of her words sank in. Greg had been more dangerous than either of us realized. He wasn't just a man having an affair. He was a manipulator, a criminal who had been planning something far more sinister. Nancy's voice broke as she spoke. I think he was going to disappear with Thomas, leave me behind with no way to prove I wasn't involved. I thought I knew him, Henry, but I didn't. I didn't know anything. For the first time in months, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. As angry and betrayed as I had been, I realized now that she had been a victim too, just as blindsided by Greg's true nature as I had been. She had nearly lost everything, including our son. Have you told the police about this? I asked, my voice tight. Yes, she replied. They're looking into it, but I wanted you to hear it from me. There was a long silence on the line. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? We were both reeling from the revelations, both trying to process how close we had come to losing Thomas forever. I'm glad you found it, Nancy, I finally said, my voice softer than I intended. You did the right thing. She let out a shaky breath, as if she had been holding it in the whole time. Thank you, Henry. I know I can't fix what I've done, but I'm trying. I didn't respond. I didn't have the energy to reopen old wounds. We had both been through enough. A few weeks later, I received a call from the detective working on Greg's case. He asked if I could come down to the station to go over some new developments. The last thing I wanted was more bad news, but I agreed. I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened. When I arrived at the police station, Detective Green greeted me with a grave expression. He led me to a small conference room where he laid out several files on the table. We've uncovered more evidence since Greg's arrest, Green said, flipping open one of the files. It appears he was working with some very dangerous people who don't like loose ends. What do you mean, loose ends? I asked, a sinking feeling in my stomach. Green met my gaze, his expression serious. We believe Greg was preparing to flee the country before we arrested him. He had ties to a crime syndicate involved in human trafficking. The fake passport we found, along with several other documents, suggest he was planning to use Nancy and Thomas as leverage. If things went south, he would have left the country, taking your son with him, and framed Nancy for the whole operation. The room spun around me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Greg had been prepared to sell us all out, to destroy Nancy's life, and to take my son into a world of unimaginable danger. We're working with international agencies now, Green continued. But there's more. Greg wasn't acting alone. We've identified several of his associates, people who are still at large. They may try to contact you or Nancy in the future, and we want you to be vigilant. Contact us? Why? Green's expression hardened. They may want to tie up loose ends, Henry. Greg's arrest has put them at risk, and they don't want any witnesses. You and Nancy need to be careful. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to comprehend everything. Greg wasn't just a con man or a cheater. He was a key player in something much bigger, much darker than I had imagined. And now, even though he was in jail, the threat wasn't over. I left the police station in a daze, my mind racing with thoughts of how to protect Thomas. The idea that Greg's associates might come after us, after my son, was terrifying. I didn't know what to do or where to turn. I called Nancy on the drive home, my voice shaking as I told her what the detective had said. She was silent for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was trembling. We need to leave, Henry, she said. We need to get out of town. It's not safe for us here. I agreed. The threat was too real, too dangerous to ignore. We couldn't stay in the same city, waiting for something to happen. I wasn't willing to take that chance, not with Thomas's life on the line. We made plans to relocate, to start fresh in a new town, far from the memories of what had happened, far from the dangers that still lurked in the shadows. It wasn't easy. The logistics of uprooting our lives, finding new jobs, and making sure Thomas had a stable environment were overwhelming. But it was the only option. Nancy's parents helped us during the transition. They were devastated by what had happened, but they rallied around us, offering support in every way they could. I took a leave of absence from my job, and we rented a house in a small town a few hours away where no one knew our story. The move brought a sense of relief, but also a lingering unease. Even in the new town, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, watching for signs that someone might be following us. I installed security cameras around the house, changed our phone numbers, and made sure we kept a low profile. Nancy and I were no longer together in any meaningful sense, but we worked together for Thomas's sake. Our co-parenting arrangement was tense at first, but as the weeks passed, we found a rhythm that worked. I could see that Nancy was trying to make amends, even if the damage between us was beyond repair. As the months went on, the legal proceedings surrounding Greg's case continued. More of his associates were arrested, and some of them were prosecuted. But the danger never fully disappeared. Detective Green kept us informed, reminding us to remain vigilant, to be cautious. There were moments when I thought about leaving the country altogether, starting over somewhere far away from all the chaos. But that wasn't realistic. I had responsibilities, Thomas, my family, the life I was trying to rebuild. Running wasn't an option. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's shadow would always be there, lurking at the edges of our new life. One afternoon, about a year after the move, I received a letter. It was sent to my new address, which immediately set off alarm bells. Very few people knew where we had moved, and I had been careful not to leave any paper trails. The envelope was plain, no return address, and my heart pounded as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with just one line written on it. "We're still watching." My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Who had sent this? How had they found us? After everything we had done to disappear, someone still knew where we were. I immediately called Detective Green, who promised to look into it, but I could tell by the tone of his voice that there wasn't much he could do. Whoever had sent the letter was being careful. They weren't making threats, at least, not directly. But the message was clear. The past wasn't done with us. The days after receiving the letter were filled with dread. I became hypervigilant, scanning every unfamiliar face, watching for anything out of the ordinary. Nancy was terrified, and we took extra precautions with Thomas, keeping him close, avoiding public places where we might be exposed. But as the days turned into weeks, nothing happened. No more letters, no strange cars parked outside the house, no unknown calls. It was almost as if the message had been sent to remind us that we could never truly escape, but that for now, they were choosing to leave us alone. Still, I couldn't relax. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was unfinished business. Then, one night, I received a phone call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, my heart racing. "Hello?" There was a long pause on the other end, and then a familiar voice spoke. A voice I hadn't heard in over a year. "Henry, it's Greg." My blood ran cold. Greg was supposed to be in prison. How was he calling me? I could barely speak, my mind reeling with 1,000 questions. "Greg?" I managed to say, my voice shaking. "How are you?" "There's no time for that," Greg interrupted, his voice low and urgent. "You need to listen to me. I don't have much time." "What the hell do you want?" I snapped, my fear quickly turning to anger. "You're supposed to be in prison. How did you find us?" "I don't have time to explain," Greg said quickly, "but I didn't call to hurt you. I called to warn you. The people I worked with, they're not done with you. They're still out there, and they know where you are." My breath caught in my throat. "What are you talking about? Who knows where we are?" "The syndicate," Greg said, his voice filled with urgency. "The ones I was laundering money for. They've been watching you, Henry. They're waiting for the right moment." Panic gripped me. "Why should I believe anything you say?" Greg's voice softened. "Because I'm trying to make things right. I owe you that much." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I could trust him, but every instinct told me that this was the truth. The letter, the feeling of being watched, It all made sense now. "Greg, what do I do?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Greg spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Run." That night, I packed everything. I didn't know if I could trust Greg, but I couldn't take the risk of staying. I woke Nancy, explained everything, and we made the decision to leave. We packed Thomas into the car and drove through the night, heading for a place far away from where anyone could find us. As I drove, I kept replaying Greg's final words over and over in my mind. Run. It was the last thing I ever heard from him. Whether he had escaped or was killed for what he knew, I would never find out. For now, all that mattered was keeping my son safe. The past had come back to haunt us one last time, but this time, I was ready. We would disappear. We would start over again. I would protect my family, no matter the cost. And this time, no one would find us. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below.